choose 21st of September.
What was it doing?
Sorry, ma'am?
Why was it just switching off?
It's recording now.
Okay. Right, moving on. Put that over your nose. Okay, right, moving on. Okay. Right, so the last thing that we have to do in this section of population ecology before we get on to human is ecological succession.
Before we get notes on humans too.
I'm under the impression that
Oh, wow.
efficiency. Okay, right, so focus, listen carefully. Okay, ecological succession is the gradual process of change in species composition of an ecological community over time. So that means that if you have an area and you just leave it for a long period of time, very often you will see that the kind of organisms that you find there change over a period of time. Now, many of you in this area will have seen that they do things like they clear land and they start to build on that land and then they delay for a period of time. And you will see various organisms come to live in that area, and it's not the same over time. So you see, originally at the beginning, it is very hardy kind of organisms, because if they've cleared land, there's no shade, there's no shelter from wind. Quite often the soil is not very fertile. And if the soil is not very fertile, it doesn't hold water well. Okay, so I just need to point out something that you guys seem to be clueless about. Okay, what is humus? Not to be confused with humus.
Isn't it like the topsoil? No. It's like the decomposition of like leaves or something like that and makes the topsoil.
Okay, so it is the dead and decaying plant and animal matter. Don't write this down. This is just something that you should actually already know. All right, so it'll be the dead and decaying stuff between the rock particles in the soil. Why is it an advantage to have humus?
Isn't it a good fertilizer?
Okay, so first of all, it provides, and guys, please be careful how you say this. Oh my word. Provides minerals. Okay, just be careful how you say it. It provides minerals for plants to grow. And what's the second important reason why humus is important? Oh, God.
It doesn't it hold down the top of nice fruit and everyone has to keep quiet. Just make it stationary for plants to grow, easy for seeds. Okay. It can be stepped on.
Can be stepped on.
I don't know, compressed.
Emily?
It's kind of like provides minerals, but if the top layer is gone, then it'll take a long time to grow back, and then the zebra or whatever can't eat it, and then they die.
Oh, that's not what zebra eat. They eat the top layers of grass. Don't get that confused. Okay, so while I understand why I understand what you're answering, you're not answering the actual question. So you're saying, why is it important to keep the humus in the soil? But I'm asking you, why is humus important? Why is it important? You're answering why is it important not to lose this topsoil. I'm asking why is the actual humus important? So it provides minerals for plants to grow. And there's something else terribly, terribly important. Yep.
No, I'm probably wrong. But
That's fine.
it provides like a little ecosystem for. No.
No, that's correct.
Is it better guess that it gets compressed in?
No, you're actually correct, but that's because it provides minerals and because of the other factor that I'm looking for here. It acts as a sponge. It acts as a sponge and it holds water. So when it rains onto soil that doesn't have humus, what actually happens is the water percolates. Do you know this word percolates? Oi. Okay, the water percolates down through the soil. It's not held there for the roots of the plants to absorb it. So when the soil doesn't have humus, it doesn't hold water. So it rains and then the water's gone. So the plants can't absorb water because there is no water. It's gone already. It's gone right down to the water table. When there is humus, then the humus holds the water in that top layer. And it's always available for plants. Okay, so that's the second important reason why there is humus. Okay, so that's just a by the way because it fits into something that I want to say to you just now. Now there are two different kinds of ecological succession. The first one is primary succession. And this is defined as the establishment of a community where none existed before. And this would happen on bare rock. So if, for example, there was a glacier in an area or an ice sheet in an area, and that glacier retreated, in other words, melted, or the ice sheet melted, or there was a volcanic eruption and lava was deposited over a whole area, then there were no living organisms there before. There are no living organisms, there's normally no soil. And what you will see is a very clear sequence of events that happens until eventually you get living organisms as a stable climax community. So, all right, let's just show you a picture first. Really? Okay. So here we've got a glacier in a valley, and the glacier is, because of global warming, global climate change, that glacier is actually retreating. In other words, it's melting. And so what you're left with is a valley that is totally bare. There's no soil, and there are no living organisms. And what happens is, over time, you get small organisms growing, then bigger organisms, and finally, like a forest. In this particular area, it will end up as a forest, because that's what the climate's suited for. However, let's go through it. Okay. So what actually happens is, remember, because there's no soil initially, how are you going to get living organisms to grow there? And so there's a very, very set sequence of events that occurs. Okay, the first organisms that grow there are organisms which can withstand very, very harsh conditions, and also they don't need much soil. Okay, so they're going to be tiny little organisms that live in little cracks in rocks, and they can withstand very, very harsh conditions. And these are always referred to as pioneer species, because they are the first ones to colonize an area. So, They have adaptations that enable them to survive in very harsh environments, very often very low or very high temperatures, and dehydration or drying out occurs because there's nothing to shelter them from the wind and there's no shade. Okay. These pioneer species are usually small plant-like species, lichen, algae, moss. As soon as those little tiny original pioneer species exist there, okay, so now you've got these tiny little species existing. They've got short little roots or root-like structures. They break down rock and they make soil. Because that is what soil is, it's broken down rock. And then some of them die. And when they die, they become humus. And when there is humus, then conditions are much, much more suited for other organisms to survive. Okay? Turning it this way. Guys, you must tell me if you can't see the board. Okay. So they make humus and they make soil. And conditions then become much, much more favorable for other organisms to live there. And so bigger plants will start to grow there. Okay, so they enable other plants, larger plants, to inhabit the area. Generally, firstly, it's grasses. And then grasses increase this whole process. Their roots break down rocks. Their roots make more soil. Grasses die. That makes humus. And so increasingly the layer of soil will get thicker and the layer of soil will have more humus and be more favorable for other plants to grow. And as soon as that happens, you can get bigger plants growing there. And those bigger plants shade areas, and they also make ecological niches, habitats for other organisms to live. Because now you can have little spiders living here, little insects living here. They couldn't initially live on bare rock because conditions were just too harsh. Okay, so as generations of pioneers live and die, they help to build soil by breaking down the rock, and they improve the soil by adding humus to it as they die. So this is lava. The black stuff is lava from a volcanic eruption. And lava is very, very hard, but what happens is lava quite often cracks. So as the lava cracks, little pioneer plants can go and seeds can land or spores can land, and they often germinate within the cracks of the lava, and they will then break down the rock to form soil, and they will form environments for other organisms to grow. So these are pioneer species. In this case, it was ferns, which is unusual because ferns are quite relatively big in comparison to moss. Okay, so ecological niches are created for other species which require less harsh conditions, and these then replace the pioneer species. These following species tend to be slightly larger, they tend to be more specialized, they will grow over the top of the original pioneers, and they compete with them for sunlight. So if the next set of organisms that grows is bigger than the original pioneer species, because they're little ferns and grasses and things like that, then the pioneer species doesn't get any sunlight, therefore the pioneer species tends to die. When the pioneer species die, they make more humus. Okay, so they then will exclude the original pioneer species. They'll outcompete them. What kind of competition, guys? got two different options here.
Inter.
Intra, isn't it?
It's inter.
Because they're not the same.
Different
species.
Inter. When you play house hockey between different houses, it's inter house hockey. And they're different species, so it's inter. Okay. Insect spiders and other little animals become part of the community because now they can get food, and therefore they become the community becomes more and more diverse with more and more different species. Okay, gradually as the ecosystem develops and supplies of water and nutrients become more predictable, because of the breakdown of organic matter, grasses and other small plants invade the community. They're available for herbivores, large and small, and you get a succession that goes like this. So this is a primary succession because it starts with no organisms and generally no soil. Primary succession. Okay. So these organisms are called the pioneer species, and these organisms are called the climax species. Because generally that's as far as it'll go, and it'll stay with this kind of organism living there. And by then, the layer of soil is quite thick. Okay, very diverse species, lots of different kinds of species, both plants and animals. Here, the pioneer species, it tends to be a lot of similar organisms. Okay. All right. So the final community is the climax community. That would be those organisms. Okay, all right. The nature of the climax community depends on the abiotic factors, including the climate of the area. So what organisms make up the climax community depends on where we're looking at this. If you're looking at this in Alaska, it's going to be a totally different climax community to if you look at it on an island on the equator in Galapagos. Okay, because the climate is completely different. Okay, if conditions change for whatever reason, the climax community may change, but generally the climax community just stays like that. It may take thousands of years for a pioneer community to develop into a climax community. Okay. Right, we happy? Okay, there we go, and you can go and watch that. Secondary succession occurs when you've got an established community and some or other big disaster thing happens that kills many of the organisms there. Not all of them, and there is soil, because there were living organisms there. It was a proper community there. Something happens, like a fire or a flood or something like that, and so there is soil and there were living organisms there before. Okay. And generally, not all the living organisms die. So after a disturbance destroys a community, the forces that initially acted to build the community take over again, and a new sequence of community development occurs. This is called secondary succession. Now, in secondary succession, you would never get it going back to absolute bare rock, no soil, no seeds, no nothing. It would go back a few stages and it would start from there. Okay, so early colonizers possess adaptations that allow them to establish a population quickly. Later arriving species are often K-strategy species. Slow development, delayed reproduction, large body size, repeated reproduction, fewer larger offspring, long lifespan of the offspring. Okay, so this would be an example of a cycle of secondary succession. So there's a disturbance, for example, there's a fire, and a lot of the trees are burnt, and therefore you go through a cycle from the grasses, not pioneers normally, shrubs, small trees, climax forest. If this occurs in an area where the climax community is normally a forest. But it depends on the area. So sometimes secondary succession doesn't lead to a climax community. For example, many grasslands are maintained by a combination of grazing and fire. If grazing and fire doesn't occur, grasslands very often develop into shrubland and then into forest. When these factors are, however, grazing and fire present, they create a permanent grassland as an end point. Obviously, different species succession in different areas, different endpoints, depending on the environment conditions and the kinds of plants and animals that are there. So this is an example of a secondary succession. You get a fire, and over a much shorter period of time than with primary succession, you end up with a climax community. Okay. This happens a lot in South Africa.
Yeah, and they always burn in the grass.
Yeah, so you'll see it very often in the game reserves. They have controlled burning to get rid of the trees and to maintain it as more grasses. Elephants do this naturally. Elephants push down the trees and maintain grasslands. Okay, so in areas that should have lots of big trees, elephants very often have pushed them down, and they're artificially maintaining grasslands there. Much faster, you can watch that. It calls soil dirt because it's an American thing. Americans are a bit confused sometimes. You must be able to compare primary and secondary succession. They're very fond of that. So succession is a very short section of work, but they very often will ask you succession because they are expected to ask it. But there's very little they can ask you. You can earn like 4 marks in this by just learning those rules about primary is no living organisms and no soil. Secondary is there were living organisms, there is soil. And that they start off as pioneer and they end off as a climax. Okay guys, that's it for this part of population. How are we doing? How has our homework been? What does that mean? Are you lying to me? What are your cycle tests this week, guys?
Wait, is it you? Oh, Geo kids. Wait, can I just get something to a Geo kid?
Hey,
Man, physics students, we often compare physics to Geo, and usually it's the other way around. Like the Geo students giving